And to complete our study of Unit 9 on Reconstruction, here's Lesson 42, Reconstruction Ends. We're going to be looking at the events in Reconstruction from 1870 to 1877, that we can evaluate the importance of reform legislation such as the Enforcement Acts and the Amnesty Acts. We're going to continue to look at economic, social, and political problems during Reconstruction, particularly how it affected African Americans. We can describe the importance of the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments, and finally we can evaluate the impact of Reconstruction education reform. So let's continue. One of the main goals of Reconstruction, as we've seen, was to try to reform the South and try to improve the conditions for African Americans who had spent their lives, in fact, generations in slavery. So many of these African Americans that had spent their entire lives living on their plantation had never left the plantation or been very far from home. So for the first time, many of them were allowed to actually go out and travel and leave the plantations. Many of them wanted to reunite with families because one of the real tragedies of the slave era was the fact that families could be separated by sale of parents, children away from their families. So many of them wanted to find their family members and reunite them. Some of them just traveled for the first time just because they could, for the sheer pleasure of traveling or to seek new jobs. However, a major obstacle to achieving these new opportunities was a lack of education in the African American community. And in fact, during the slave era, through much of the South, it was actually illegal to teach a slave to read or write, or for slaves to educate their families or even themselves. So this would have to be addressed if they were going to achieve their goals. Part of this was done through the Freedmen's Bureau and the founding of freedmen's schools. Some of these were, again, done through the federal government, others through private charities and churches. We also see the first African American colleges formed at this time. These are sometimes referred to as HBCUs, for historically black colleges and universities. Howard University in Washington, D.C. is one example. We also have Morehouse College and Spelman College in Atlanta. And here in Texas, we have such as Texas Southern University and Prairie View A&M University as examples in Texas. Now that slavery was over, these former slaves had to find a way to make a living for themselves and their families. Freedmen wanted land in order to farm for themselves. This is what they had done mostly as slaves. This is what they knew. This is what they wanted to continue to do, but now for themselves and their families. Radical Republicans in Congress put forth a bill to take land from plantation owners in the South and to distribute this to former slaves under the slogan of giving each slave 40 acres and a mule to make their own living. However, the idea of taking private property and giving it out to others violated property rights under, you guessed it, the Fifth Amendment. So this was ultimately rejected by Congress. So freedmen needed jobs, a way to support themselves, but landowners still needed labor to maintain their plantations. So they adopted the system of sharecropping, which is a type of tenant farming. In sharecropping, the farmer rents the land from the landowner, and in some cases even rents tools and seed and supplies. And then at the end of the harvest season, they pay the landowner with a share of their crop instead of cash. The main crops that were grown under sharecropping system were, of course, cotton, tobacco, and sugarcane, the same ones that had been grown under the plantation system. So former slaves and even poor whites hoped that the sharecropping system would provide them the means that over time they could become economically independent and own their own property and their own land. So that was the hope for sharecroppers. However, the reality was much different. Sharecroppers were in constant debt and unable to leave because they could not pay their debts to their landowner. And for many, sharecropping was not much better than slavery. If we look at the sharecropper cycle of poverty here, again we see that the sharecropper is promised land and seed in exchange for half their crops. So in order to maintain their farm during the growing season, the sharecropper will buy food and clothing and supplies on credit from the landowner's store. So they plant and harvest their crops, and at the end of the harvest season they give a portion of their crops to the landowner. However, the landowners are the ones who are keeping the books and who are actually accounting for the debts. And typically at the end of the season, the sharecropper came up short in what they owed the landowner. So in order to pay that debt, they had to promise to stay on another year and continue to work that land until those debts were paid. But this happened year after year. So what happened is that most sharecroppers found themselves in the cycle of debt and essentially living like they had as slaves, where they were tied to the land and continually working for the same landowner. With the passage of the 14th Amendment granting citizenship and the 15th Amendment granting voting rights to African American men, African Americans were able to assert their rights in the South, and they continued to vote for Republicans who supported reforms in the South. Whites who had lost the right to vote reacted to this by forming terrorist groups to fight Reconstruction and to fight Northern reforms in the South. One of these groups, probably the best well known, is the Ku Klux Klan, known for their white hoods and white cloaks. Another group was the White League. These groups used threats and violence against African Americans and also against white government officials. They sometimes attacked Freedmen's Bureau officials, freedmen's schools, but the goal was to try to use both terrorism and actual violence to, first of all, discourage these reforms and to prevent African Americans from enacting their civil rights and especially from voting. So to combat these acts, the Republicans in Congress passed the Enforcement Acts of 1870 and 1871 to fight terrorist groups such as the KKK. These were intended to enforce the 14th and 15th Amendments. It made it illegal to interfere with anyone's right to vote, and Grant sent the military south to enforce the acts much as they had done during the Reconstruction Acts of 1867. And the Enforcement Acts were very effective at first. They reduced Klan attacks, but few were actually convicted in Southern courts. One of the things that was going on here is that you had the Southern states still continuing to resist reforms and the Southern legal process not supporting Reconstruction reforms. Later on, Supreme Court rulings blocked these federal enforcement of civil rights laws. One of the most famous cases was called the U.S. v. Cruikshank, in which the Supreme Court said that acts of terrorism by the KKK were committed by individuals and not by the states, and that the Enforcement Acts only applied to official state action, not individuals. So this essentially left African Americans at the mercy of terrorist groups and made them powerless to stop this. Another development that rolled back Reconstruction was in 1872, and this was the passage of the Amnesty Act. And the Amnesty Act pardoned most former Confederates, and it restored white Southerners' voting rights. Now these white Southerners began to once again vote for the Democrats, and being the majority, the Democratic Party began to win elections in the South over Republicans. In fact, they called themselves the Redeemer Democrats, and that they were elected to save the South from Republican rule and Northern reform. So by 1876, most of the Southern states were back under Democratic control, and they reversed many of the social reforms that had happened during Republican Reconstruction. In the election of 1876, Rutherford B. Hayes was the Republican candidate running against Samuel Tilden, the Democrat. Tilden won the popular vote, but not enough electoral votes to win the election, and there was a dispute over 20 electoral votes in particular. Republicans controlled the House, so when this went to the House, they voted to award these electoral votes to Hayes, the Republican, making him the official winner. However, Democrats refused to accept these results, and Inauguration Day approached without a real determined winner or accepted winner to the presidential election of 1876. So this is going to result in a compromise that will bring Reconstruction to an end. After long negotiations, both sides agreed to the Compromise of 1877. Democrats recognized Hayes as the winner, so they will allow the Republicans to hold the presidency. However, federal troops are going to withdraw from the South. These federal troops were really the only thing that was protecting most African Americans and protecting Reconstruction reforms. They also promised that they would send federal aid to help rebuild the South after the destruction of the Civil War. So after 12 years, Reconstruction is now over. One of the lessons for the South of the Civil War was the need to modernize their economies. So going into the late 1800s and well into the 1900s, the South begins to build factories such as textile works. Of course, they still have a lot of cotton production, iron works, and other types of factories. But Democrats used their regained political power to cut taxes. This resulted in the closing of public schools and a reduction of government services, most of which benefited African Americans and poor whites. They also passed laws that restricted the rights of African Americans to vote. Now, the 15th Amendment literally says that you cannot use race as a means to restrict someone's voting rights. So they used other things, such as literacy tests, meaning that testing your ability to read and write, and poll taxes, meaning they charged a fee for the right to vote, which tended to discriminate against, of course, African Americans and poor whites. They also passed Jim Crow laws, which established segregation, meaning the dividing and separation of the races, as strict public policy in nearly all public facilities. That meant separate restrooms, separate dining rooms, separate cars on trains. Nearly all public facilities were segregated by race. And this segregation was upheld later in the Supreme Court case of Plessy v. Ferguson in 1896. So while the Reconstruction era saw many important changes, it saw the beginning of African American education, the founding of African American universities and colleges, and slavery was over, yes. But many of those social reforms and gains were rolled back. African Americans, by losing the right to vote, also lost the ability to run for office, and it would be a long time before African Americans would be able to once again represent their fellow citizens in the government and in politics. And in fact, it really wasn't until the Civil Rights Acts of the 1950s, and especially in the 1960s, that many of these Jim Crow laws were finally done away with. So that's sort of the legacy of Reconstruction here. So our Lesson 42 thoughts. How did African Americans try to improve their quality of life during Reconstruction, and what opposition did they face from those opposed to reform? Number 2, why was sharecropping a difficult way for poor farmers to make a living? And finally, number 3, looking at the achievements and setbacks of Reconstruction to reform the South, would you consider this era overall a success or a failure in achieving Lincoln's goals after the Civil War? Well, guys, that completes Unit 9, and that completes our study this year of U.S. history from 1607 to 1877. And for those of you in Texas, I wish you all the best in studying for your Social Studies star, and have a great year and a great summer. Thank you for listening.